No private sector organization, in most cases, even in growth mode, competes with the public sector. The public sector has a different, selling point, a far more stable work life.
For largely homogenous countries, so let's take the opposite to countries with high levels of immigration and high levels of expats. In largely homogenous nations, actually the idea of diversity is very different, right? It's not about ethnicity, it's about social class, it's about gender, it's about lots of other areas where that focus is to bring balance.
When I hear of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that's the first thought that comes to my mind is that's one key priority that keeps global TA leaders awake at night.
Farooq, absolutely wonderful to have you on the show, buddy.
Hey, Sam, thank you for having me over.
Yeah, awesome. So glad we got to meet face to face, and then we get this wonderful opportunity to connect again and share some of the learnings from when we met. So just for the listeners, would love to get an introduction as to who you are and kind of what you do.
Lovely. So I'm Farooq Husain. I lead the talent acquisition for Dell Technologies. I'm based in Dubai, and I'm responsible for Middle East, Turkey, and Africa. I've just finished a little over 14 years with the organization, so fairly, I would say, tenured. I'm a camel in the Middle East now, and I love every bit of the challenge.
Awesome. And that is a fair tenure in talent acquisition. You don't come across that too often. So yeah, you must really love it there. Awesome. And obviously we met, as part of the Resourcing Leaders Middle East Summit and ran a really kind of empowering session looking at the commercial impact of a talent acquisition function. And you led a group of individuals, and you were really looking at diversity. And I thought the outputs were so fantastic that we had to really take a moment, share those with others, and be able to replay back some of that story. I think before we do, I want to kind of zoom out just a little bit, look at kind of the global impact when we think about diversity, equality, inclusion. It is without doubt direct correlation between a more diverse organization and revenue generated by that organization and profit. That has been well covered, well documented by many research companies and many organizations. So that is almost indisputable. I think the bit which underpins that is then what's the mechanics then of evidencing, hey, this program has had X impact, and this is what we've contributed towards it, which really want to focus on today at a global and national level. It's always hard to jump into a big meaty subject like diversity, with a question. So I think why don't we start with your kind of zoomed out view from a global perspective of the impact of diversity within an organization.
Sure, Sam. So when I hear of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that's the first thought that comes to my mind is that's one key priority that keeps global TA leaders awake at night. You could talk about scarcity of talent pool, you could talk about growth, you could talk about global turbulences. Diversity is one common theme across industries. When I speak to TA leaders globally and in the region, is one of their top 3 priorities, is something that they're struggling with at some point in time or trying to innovate or get up the bar. And as TA, whenever you talk to a TA leader, they would connect diversity with attracting candidates, getting them to stay, sparking innovation, improving employee performance. I understand ethically diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform their peers, expanding your markets, boosting financial performance. I believe my research tells me diverse firms generate 2.3 times more cash flow per employee and 1.4 times more revenue. So there's a huge set of data sets that tells you that this topic is here to stay, and it is going to be a key driver of success for TA leaders in the region and globally.
Awesome. And I think those sound bites absolutely hit home as well. We're not talking about small figures here. This is a tangible business impact, not just a societal one as well. When we're thinking about a global scale, what are some of the things that you've seen which have worked well? What are some of the measures which maybe work a bit more universally when thinking about, direct impact from diversity?
I think from our standpoint, when I try to localize the issue, when I say localize, I'm looking at my remit, which is Middle East and Turkey and Africa. One thing that comes to mind, and as I researched this morning about this topic before our conversation, the key message here was diversity is like plugging a guitar into an amplifier. Yeah. And as I look back and I look at what we have done over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, getting our diversity ratios up, creating a very diverse talent force across the region, and we're in growth mode in most locations. And we are operating out of a region where talent is scarce as far as IT is concerned. I think very clearly this is where you hit the nail on the head. You have, and as I connect diversity into a very key topic, which is again something that kind of is the DNA that builds into diversity, is localization. That is something you heard during the RL 100 event, is where all TA leaders, in some form or fashion, kind of went around the room and touched back into localization. And when I go back and look at how does it help me, how does it help a TA leader like me and my peers in the region and internationally, I think there's just, to be honest, there's just too much to quote. And if I was to, at the top of my head, talk about where does that diversity from a localization perspective and equity inclusion perspective hits, clearly, first and foremost, there's a strong revenue upside. All organizations globally are looking at shareholder value. This directly feeds into it. That's the core reason why we're here, running large-scale companies or bringing talent for them. When I look at it from a talent perspective, it is directly impacting time to fill, less no-shows, lower recruiting cost when I compare this to international relocations and the fear of a candidate not showing up on day one, less empty seats. That's a very, very big draw for a recruiting leader, which automatically results into shorter time to productivity. And there's a fair bit of data as you research this topic, which tells you the gain that you have on productivity as you build diverse workforces. A very key driver is a lesser loss of opportunity. Every time you have an empty seat where you're trying to find a person and you have a team that's less diverse, you're losing opportunity where competition is picking and starting to eat your part of the pie. Going back into revenues, definitely a very, very clear focus on increased market cap. A Forbes study that I came across reported that companies with local and diverse workforce produce 19% more revenue versus their peers who did not have diverse and local workforces. I think the writing's on the wall. There's just no denial. Companies with diverse workforce are 35% more likely to experience greater financial results. Diverse companies are 70% more likely to capture larger markets, newer markets, which means bigger audience. Absolutely, there's enough data to prove that it boosts creativity, it boosts innovation, it reduces turnover, it opens doors into specific sectors. In this region, clearly it opens door into public sectors as you talk about localization and connect that back into diversity. So the benefits are just, I mean, you can't stop counting them. There's just too many to code. But clearly, this is what comes to mind when we talk about the actual impact.
Yeah, and it's really nuanced, right? And I think this is what was so fascinating for me, and I think what will be fascinating for others that are maybe thinking about hiring in the region, or maybe that's their role and remit and responsibility, or maybe they're hiring in the region now, particularly in the GCC, because actually what we're talking about here for diversity is more national talent, right? More people, from that location, as opposed to people with a different ethnic heritage, right? And I think that's in complete contrast to many of the areas when we think about diversity. Typically, it's actually, the national identity, the people with ethnic heritage from the nation in which they live tend to be the highest in terms of level of employment, and it's actually people with different ethnic heritage when we think about ethnicity that organizations are targeting and feel that they're underrepresenting as part of their workforce. So I think that nuance is fascinating. And there's some real kind of, I suppose, the which I really want to draw upon is actually we talked about revenue generation. We talked about the kind of commercial impact of bringing a more diverse workforce, but there's also restrictions, right? And challenges around if you're unable to increase the representation of your localized talent, there's like a knock-on direct revenue tax almost.
Yeah.
Would love to explore that further. Would love to share that.
I think it's a very interesting comment that you just made, Sam, is how diversity is looked at differently and how the definition changes as we move across the globe. And back in time, not anymore. This was a challenge that I, as a TA leader, had to overcome every time I spoke to my global leaders and explained diversity, because they were looking at diversity from the same lens as you would look at in mature markets or developed markets. And that's where I think the ability to understand diversity through the lens of localization is very important, because localization in the current context, whether you look at Emiratization, Saudiization, or localization in the rest of the GCC countries, is a very pivotal policy-driven initiative. It's absolutely integral to the GCC countries as they start to overcome the large-scale unemployment in their locations. And in most cases, this initiative is spearheaded by the government. The core objective is to bring in employment opportunities for nationals within the private sector. Now, historically, public sector has always had that kind of, bulk of talent that has, local talent that has gone into and worked with the public sector. The key aim here is to reduce reliance on expats. And if you look at some of the vibrant economies in the GCC, the UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Kuwait in particular, they have for decades had a very heavy reliance on expats. And the program is very focused on tackling unemployment rates among citizens and to take care of the historical dependency on foreign labor. I think one key challenge that comes out of this comment is the ability to align educational outcomes to the job market needs, which is, I think, where we start. And a lot of times where we miss the gap is we as TA leaders start to look at ourselves only in the light of the final consumer, which is when you're hiring that talent. I think what we got to start with is start to go back and invest in that talent market by developing that talent while you may not necessarily hire them immediately, and incubate them and develop them and bring them up the curve over a period of years, possibly half a decade before that becomes a larger talent pool. So it's a much broader topic in that context, right? But what's important is to understand localization challenges and how it can actually be tackled. And then coming on to your point around, compliance, penalties, and how it kind of amplifies your ability to work with the government and the public sector and get more business, or it diminishes your ability to get going. And that's kind of the proof in the pudding today when you look at Saudization or Emiratization and your ability to grow your enterprises, or in terms of growth for Saudization for a particular company in the kingdom, getting more expat visas to hire more expats in the kingdom. I think they're just very, very clear now with the systems and the automated labor, balanced scorecards that they have for organizations like ourselves and other multinationals.
Yeah. It's like a mandate. And I think, again, it's definitely looking at things through a different lens in terms of, how you achieve those goals. I can't think of many other areas globally that have this mandated policy of, fixing diversity within the organizations and directly tying it to opportunity, directly tying it to restrictions. So I think, it's fascinating on that front, and one to think about for other territories. And I think that point on the difference between global and national as well is critical, because you are looking from a more developed market at the kind of outcome of diversity, and it feels the same, like cookie cutter in most areas, but actually for largely homogenous countries. So let's take the opposite to countries with high levels of immigration and high levels of expats. In largely homogenous nations, actually the idea of diversity is very different, right? It's not about ethnicity. It's about social class. It's about gender. It's about lots of other areas where that focus is to bring balance. So I think, really interesting. And then the bit which I really want to dial into now and double click into is you were talking around this kind of, I suppose you're coming at talent not just from a consumer perspective, once the kind of conveyor belt of individuals with skills have come along a horrible way of speaking about humans, but it's a nice metaphor. I was thinking about people finishing and arriving in your organization ready to add productivity, and investing as the difference. And again, another big difference I saw was high volumes of investment in talent. So I'd love to hear about programs you've seen, delve a little bit deeper into like what that practically looks like for organizations in the region.
Sure. So before I start talking about programs, just wanted to highlight one word here that you used, mandate. And that's, I think, the key, I would say, driver that you need to dial in as a TA leader in this region, and not look at it as a mandate, and explain why. Us as expats, we come into these countries, the GCC countries, the Middle East, looking for a career, looking for quality of life, looking for social security. And if you look at it, most of us and most of the TA leaders who you met during the RL100 are doing very, very well, very happy with where they are. And it's a voluntary decision to come in. How I look at localization is basically our way of giving back to the nation. And that's our way of adding value to the growth and boosting the economy of the nation, and adding possibly a very clear bottom line impact to their, visions over the next couple of decades as they go through a very, very big transformational change, which is led by the governments. So it's very important that we as TA leaders don't look at this as a mandate, as a rule. It's basically a part of our own personal growth and the organization's growth. And that's how you give back. And that's how you build an organization which is equipped to deliver alongside the 2030 strategy, the D33 strategy, all of those leadership initiatives that you see in this region. Coming on to the success with the programs, and what I'm talking about is basically coming from the conversation that we had with the RL 100 group, and we had representatives, TA leaders from all across sectors: aviation, oil and gas, services, consumer, retail, and there was some very, very, I would say, fine case studies which were learnings. I think where we need to start very categorically is look at a core policy adjustment. And unless we have that driven top down, conversation between a recruiter and a hiring manager is not going to bear fruits. By that, what I mean is you're going to have the buy-in from your executives. That's where you start. This is the direction the country is going. This is how we need to stay ahead. And here's why we need to do it. And unless that happens, us as TA feeding in candidates into the hiring managers and trying to reason why they should be considered versus expats is futile, is actually basically missing the point. Once that is set in place, we need to step back. And as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, we are very, in most cases as TA leaders, focused on the end consumption. And that's what we need to step away from. And that's where we need to step back and start to look at very targeted development educational programs that allow us to expand the talent pool. So you're not just looking at what's available, you're actually starting to go into schools, you're starting to go into high schools, you're starting to go into STEM courses, you're starting to go into engineering colleges and universities and say, here's what a career in technology or retail or oil and gas looks like. Here are the subjects that you need to study. Give them a know-how of what lies ahead in the corporate life. And that's where you upskill them. And multiple organizations globally have had success with these programs. But unless we start to invest time, effort, energy into developing that talent pool, we're never going to be at the end of it reaping the reward, which is hiring that local population. A very clear effort that has worked for some of our peers based on that RL 100 conversation is incentivizing your business units for employing nationals or getting their localization numbers up. It's a big deal because as you start this conversation, you will be surprised to hear that we still have pockets of the hiring community which doesn't get it, like the way TA does. And that's where it's always TA trying to explain why it is important, pushing that mandate that we just referred to, or using the compliance word, or trying to showcase fines that are coming our way. But that's absolutely the wrong way to look at it. Kind of puts a negative tone to this. And that's where if you can build some sort of attraction quotient to localization and diversity, just kind of hits that home very quickly. Circling back into targeted education programs, one thing that's worked for us very, very well over the last few years is internship programs. Bring them in, have a try before you buy approach, show them what an organization offers in terms of their cultural focus, in terms of their ethics, in terms of their focus on environment. How do we produce? How do we sell? And give them a real peek into life in the organization before they go back, finish their education, come back and decide who they want to work with. And that's brilliant. And that population may not always come back and work with you, but that population now is a brand ambassador to your organization. Yeah. This then leads into your early talent, which is where you go into your UR hiring. And we all would say and agree globally, and this is not so different here in the region, that early talent, which is university hiring, is basically the most, I would say, solid key driver to localization globally and in the region. Yeah. If you have your UR hiring right, which can only succeed if you have your internship and your targeted development and education programs right, you've possibly won half the battle in that context. If the UR programs don't succeed, you're not getting that middle management and top management because you've got to build that talent pool from the bottom up. Academies for vocational training, even organizations in that RL 100 talked about, running coffee conversation with that target local population. Referrals, definitely, absolutely. A sort of an old school channel, but that's never going to die. That's never going to become irrelevant. When you go to that same population that you have hired or brought through the door and said, here's what I'm looking at, who's in your phone book or in your friend circle that you can refer, or your family, absolutely works because now they are recommending you. They are selling you as ambassadors for the brand. Partnerships with very focused communities, and in some cases, partnerships with people with determination, those who have special needs, those kind of communities who bring that talent back into the corporate workforce are absolutely brilliant. We have run very successfully the STEM program where we bring in female STEM students into specific locations in the region and take them through a mentorship program over a space of 30, 60, 90 days, take them through workshops, take them through multiple other avenues, and then send them back into the the life of a student for them to use that over the next few years. Another successful initiative that comes to mind, which is working for most of us in this region, is a restart program, welcoming females. And I'm slightly digressing from the topic as I'm talking about diversity and localization, but I'm also starting to pick up female diversity because it's as important as it is in the rest of the world. So bringing in females who have taken work breaks for family reasons. So specific programs that are focused on bringing them back into the working life, giving them a softer landing, giving them very focused trainings, giving them very focused learning opportunities before they hit the ground running and compete with those who have not had a break. So these are some of the things that have worked for us, for our peers, and industry peers in the region.
And I'd love to dial in as well. I think just to really focus on that kind of philanthropic element of organizations paying back to the communities in which they benefited from. And I think not just localized to the GCC, organizations should be doing that globally. And I love that kind of vision and attachment to it. The other part which you referenced though was regarding executive buy-in, right, to make programs work. And a lot of the things you're talking about have that long tail view to them of, you need to build for tomorrow. These are long programs that you're going to be yielding results with down the line, not in the next quarter report, not in the next annual report. And of course, if you want a tree today and you don't have any, you need to plant a seed, right? So it definitely needs to work. But I think the bit which actually, although you don't want to be tied to compliance, although you don't want to be tied to the mandate, actually that helps justify the business case internally. Yes, we can do some stuff which is near term, which is now, and there's plenty of tactics for that, and maybe we'll cover some of those in terms of how you're competing right now for mid to senior talent. But the reality is, if we want to compete long term, if we want to meet these, the guidance, the government-led guidance, and ensure profitability and stability, then we need to invest for tomorrow now, and we need to be shown to be doing these things. So I do feel that kind of more of state involvement with driving these programs, although it might not be the right thing in the long term, you'd hope that the economy would be more balanced and, there'd be better pathways into enterprise by running lots of different programs and by leading with a mandate. Actually, it helps drive that change. It gives a real tangible reason for talent acquisition to go and say, hey, we're at the coalface of this. We're going to be driving this change. And these are the 6 things that we need to do to be able to achieve these goals. And this is why. And here's a revenue number attached to it.
Yeah.
Yes, you can talk about the revenue growth. You can talk about the stuff which is ubiquitous globally. But actually, a lot of that stuff is then right here, right now. We're going to have a cost implication if we don't do this. And so it's risk as much as it is reward, which I think brings a nice balance to help drive. And it's clear that the investment is there. And there's tons of investment going into talent in the region, which is wonderful and led by organizations that have benefited from operating in the region. So it's a wonderful cycle. What about, and what I heard a lot of was this kind of fierce competition for high salaried individuals, because it really helps change that balance in market. So how does that work practically day to day? The here and now, the today's talent, not tomorrow's talent.
As you move from entry level to middle management and leadership talent, the landscape changes. The war is much more, I would say, tougher and harder and much more cutthroat than what you would imagine at entry level. Yes, you have a clear war for talent at entry level. I can't deny that. But as you move into countries like Saudi and UAE and Kuwait and Qatar, and you look at mid to senior level talent, this is talent that has, I would look at 8+ years of relevant experience, has worked with public sector, private sector, has the technical know-how. Ideally, somebody for us would be, a typical sales leader, BD kind of a profile. Clearly, there are very few options from a candidate pool point of view, and everybody between us and the vendors is looking at the same talent pool, and that just changes the game. So you're then looking at a candidate who, unlike an expat, at a given point in time is if he or she is an active candidate, is looking at least 2, if not 3 opportunities, and if you're unlucky, you're competing with the public sector, and we don't compete. No private sector organization, in most cases, even in growth mode, competes with the public sector. The public sector has a different, selling point, a far more stable work-life balance, job stability. You're working with people that they have a very strong local representations. You're working with people very similar to your background, and they don't as much get impacted as we do with what's happening in the global economies. So you're competing with a candidate, a senior talent. Let's say in a country like Saudi, the talent is talking to public sector opportunities, is talking to private sector opportunities, and you don't know it until the end, even when the offer is signed, that you have the candidate. You're still uncertain. As a TA leader, I am asking my team, if you're certain that they have resigned, if you're certain that there's no second counter offer coming in from the current employer, if you're certain that during their notice period they haven't interviewed elsewhere, have you spoken to the candidate in the last week and got a pulse of what's happening? Is the background check moving right? There's just so many moving parts, and you miss one full stop or a comma and you've lost it, and you're back to 12 weeks or 8 weeks of sourcing and interviewing and panels and decisions. So alongside the money is one element. Yes, it's absolutely difficult to seal those deals, but there's so many moving parts in that talent pool that if you don't have the eye for detail and you don't have that connection with the candidate, it's very, very easy to lose them.
And another point there, which again feels completely unique, is the idea that public sector has, you've got an inability to compete with them as private sector, whereas many kind of public sector partners that we work with, both nationally and internationally, do everything they can to try and compete with the private sector because they're unable to compete from a salary perspective. And yeah, I think the kind of other elements which you talked about are very similar in terms of that stability and less impact from macroeconomic factors, although certainly seen that in different territories globally. So it feels again like an inverse of markets, which we've certainly covered on this show and on what we talk about in events in the UK and in the US in particular. So yeah, fascinating to think about that change and what that looks like.
I think for us, over the last 5 to 7 years of focus on diversity, including localization and gender diversity, it is in the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months that for the first time we have seen a reverse flow of talent from public into private. It's very, very small in number, but it's happening. And what's driving that is that young population, which is now getting into that 10 plus years of experience, who actually want to travel, work with large multinationals, manage regional roles, don't just want to be limited to their countries or their locations. And that population is asking questions. If I want to grow in my career, I'm not worried about the stability factor. I want to work 12 hours a day. I want to put in that effort and I want to see growth and I want to go places. That population is starting to say, I will go back into the private sector. I will possibly work longer hours. I will work harder. There'll be more pressure, but I will see that growth in form of regional roles, in the form of the wider, I would say, visibility it brings to the role, the exposure to international talent that they get to work with, and international leadership that they get to work with. So a very positive note on this subject is that we see a polite reversal of talent flow moving in from public to private. And I would be very cautious when I say that, and I wouldn't celebrate that yet, but it's starting to show up in small numbers, in pockets.
And I think, feels like there's a lot of prestige attached to working in the public sector, in region versus perhaps others. I think one other area, we're talking about this flow from public to private to public. Another area is obviously we're talking emigration and immigration a lot when we're talking about the market. I think one part which we've not covered is individuals leaving the GCC, typically for education in pretty large numbers, and then potentially staying in the territories in which they're going to university or college, etc. What's the impact there? How much are you seeing that? It's something which we saw a lot in the UK in the 80s. It was called the brain drain here, when lots of engineering talent went to territories all over the world to build infrastructure projects and IT projects, etc. And we're seeing it at an earlier level in the GCC, from my understanding. But how are you combating that as an organisation? What does that look like? Are you seeing that? I love the phrase "polite return." Are you seeing something similar in this segment of talent?
So, see, when you look at the expat population in the region, there's a very clear shelf life, whether we like it or not. As their families get closer to universities, more often than not, employees and their families will, like you said rightfully, will look at moving into regions or locations where they want their kids to study, and possibly at that point consider movement, possibly at that point consider change of employment or moving with the same company. That could be one big driving factor, which most of us do go through. The other factor is, as an expat, you're anyways out of your home country. So you're out of your comfort zone. So you're not married to the place. Yeah. Now that's also partially changing with countries like the UAE bringing in a gold visa, which gives you 10-year security, and Saudi following suit. But as an expat, you're still a commodity that can move for better opportunity. So net, the impact is, and I see this with schooling. We see there's a shuffle in the classes every year or so because there's a population that's moving. Now, as that expat population moves, if organizations don't embrace the localization bit and bring that population in, they will always struggle with turnover. And that's where localization kind of just absolutely very plug and play builds into that expat shelf life where you're going to definitely at some point lose people who will move to different countries or back to their home countries for various reasons. And that's where this local population feeds in. No denial about the fact that most of the GCC countries are still very attractive locations for people to work with across all sectors. So that inflow will continue to happen. But as localization becomes more compliance driven, you will definitely, as large scale organizations, have to tick all the boxes before you can get those work permits. And that's where, again, localization is the key driver.
And then what about local talent that's moved abroad that potentially might be looking at moving back? How does that work?
It's always I would say, a slightly longer shot, a much more, I would say, firm return on investment if you're looking at early talent. So looking at, let's say, hypothetically speaking, Saudis studying in the US, finishing a master's, and then you're trying to get those to those universities. And some of our peers in the RL100 conversation brought this up, Sam, and they said, we have gone through the consulates in those countries and connected with that talent pool, brought them in for coffee and tea and connected with them and tried to bring them back. And they've had success, which is, I think, brilliant. But that's not an approach everybody can take, because you're, again, looking at a very qualified population set, which is citizens and nationals. So they are not ideally, from a price point perspective or a salary perspective, comparable to your early talent in country. So they're already at a pedestal. So it's not that easy. Yes, if you're an organization that can afford it, absolutely. Because at some point that population or a part of that population will look at coming back.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's just another, it's just another element to think about here. And it's trying to balance your diversity within your organization when actually the inflow and the outflow of talent from all different ethnic demographics is more free flowing and challenging at the same time than perhaps in other markets where, people are more rooted and stable and will be in market for a long time. So yeah, I think it's another kind of fascinating layer to it. And I think throughout what we kind of touched upon is just a whole different lens of looking at diversity. It's not easy enough to just say, hey, when we're thinking about this in each region, it's the same set of challenges, it's the same way of looking at things. It's broadening that right out. But I think the bits which we touched on at the start are ubiquitous, across any global market. There are revenue drivers, there are productivity drivers, there are outcomes based on the diversity of your organization. We've spoken a lot about ethnicity and some about gender today, but that's across all areas of diversity to drive those business outcomes. And then in turn, I kind of love this philanthropic payback, what you've kind of taken from the market, or how you've benefited from the market, and making sure that the market benefits from your presence, and then driving that change by that kind of mandate compliance piece as well, of like, this is the limiting factor. If we don't do this, we're going to be heavily impacted, so we should. So yeah, I think fascinating on that front. So absolute pleasure having you on the show today, Farooq, and thank you for sharing a fresh perspective, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Sam. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, awesome.